Christina, as part of this series and this course, we wanted to get to industry insiders and talk about the arc of sabermetrics. Now, you've been thinking and writing about baseball for a long time, and I just want you to discuss this revolution, this change in analytics as you've seen it in your career as a writer.
Well, it was an interesting phenomenon because of how much it depended upon technology to kind of create a revolution, not of concepts so much as, but really just of a worldview, an entire worldview that was informed equal parts, I'd say, by whether that was Bill James and his original work and the abstracts, and if you were of the right age and reading Bill James in high school or college in the 80s, you were already kind of adopting a worldview about the value of performance analytics and what they would teach you about baseball and about, also I think about like rational inquiry. And so right there, if you're already like, informed by an age of reason sensibility, you're already kind of there. You're already excited about like what Bill James is teaching you about how to think about the game. But Bill wasn't the only voice out there. You also had Pete Palmer and Gary Gillette, and or Pete Palmer and John Thorne, and The Hidden Game of Baseball. That was a huge book in the early '80s. You also had, from a more, I'd say, mainstream, but also inside baseball perspective, how could you not love? And certainly my favorite of all of these was Earl Weaver's Weaver on Strategy, which really kind of, well, certainly it gave me all the tips I needed on how to win with my Stratomatic team as a kid, but it really educated me about how to actually run a team and run a lineup and what works, not just not just in a way that was dependent on spreadsheets or a lot of math, but also just in terms of explaining the game and how the game's engine, about how you score runs, how you create runs, how you prevent runs, how do you manage 25 guys, how do you make all of that work. Earl was very nuts and bolts and very direct, and somebody who's talking, with the help of a great writer by the name of Terry Pluto, really explaining it to people, not only outside of baseball, but inside of baseball. It's still a book which, 30 years later, it still has a lot of value because it's talking to people in baseball about, here's how you can get all of this stuff that might be sabermetric from the or agrees with a lot of what the stat heads are proving, but more fundamentally, here's how it works in baseball, and here is how all of this stuff connects with the game's great history about why teams win and how they win. So all of that kind of combines into a mix that was dependent then, or I think informed everybody equally when you started with the beginnings of kind of like the internet, particularly before, like there was the World Wide Web. A lot of us were participating in something called Rec Sport Baseball, which was a Usenet discussion group, which was kind of like a chat room, but the signal to noise ratio was very high because it was, one, not a lot of people who could actually have access at that point. Most of us were at, research institutions. I was at the University of Chicago. Other people were at Randy Gizzarli, or Clay Davenport was at NOAA. Randy Gizzarli was at Johns Hopkins. Gary Huckabee was out in California. We all met each other online. And so when we kind of said, well, we 1995, at that point, the game was just recovering from the strike. There was no, Bill James had long since retired from writing his books. And in our conceit, we thought, well, we've learned a lot from each other from this kind of ongoing discussion about baseball and different analytical tools. At that point, Gary had this great projection tool, Vladimir, which was our first great kind of it was willing, it was a projection tool that was willing to take a few risks. And so that was something that we all kind of liked, because otherwise, modeling projections can be very bland. What at that point I think was very bland, and it was very consistent, and it didn't predict those players who would break out, and it didn't, a lot of the models didn't have, make that leap that kind of taught you, but that maybe players are capable of going all over the place and doing all sorts of stuff, and they have some control over their own careers, and how do you model or anticipate that? Gary had a modeling system that did that. So he wanted to write, he was approached by an editor to say, have you ever thought about doing a baseball annual? And then Jeff Newman, who was the editor at Simon & Schuster, who planted this idea, and his that disappears into the woodwork and is never seen again except for a couple of years later. Jeff's a great guy and like anything of a mentor and role model to me, but he was somebody who also actually helped found rotisserie baseball back in the 80s. So it's like, you know, like the way in which all of these things end up having an interrelationship. So he's working in publishing, and he'd published Weaver on Strategy, and he thinks that Gary Huckabee and people from Usenet Baseball, like Usenet Rec Sport Baseball, have something to say that's interesting about the game. And so he encourages us to, like, you know, you can do a book. And like Gary says, okay, I'm going to do a baseball annual, and I'm going to pick 4 friends to help me do this book. So he picks the 4 of us as his teammates to do the book. The first book is terrible. We were awful. If anybody has seen the white label baseball prospectus, you know, if I don't know if you have a copy, but it's a terrible book.
Joe Sheehan has told me he's got hundreds of copies somewhere in some storage room.
Yeah. Well, for the 200 or 300 people who actually bought that book, we can't thank them enough, because from that, you know, so many things became possible. But in our conceit, we thought we could write that book. In our conceit, we didn't think that the first book did not like check our ambition at all. We said, well, we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it better the second time. But the interesting thing is that it's spring of 1996. World Wide Web is only just getting really started, and we said, okay, let's create a website to talk about baseball, to advertise the book, because that's still the old world mentality of, like, you know, we'll use it as an advertising tool, and we might do a little bit of content there, a little bit of writing, just to get people to come check out the site and anticipate buying the book. Well, it wasn't very long at all that completely flipped, that the website became the important element in this equation and about baseball prospectus, and that instead the book became, you know, the once-a-year thing that it was, but that the web was really our tool to really educate and inform people, to develop ourselves as writers, because one of the things that for us was equally important was not just the metrics, but what we loved so much about Bill James is that he educated and informed you because he was funny, he was insightful, he pulled from a lot of different sources, and a lot of thought, and in the same way that we enjoy the game itself as a conversation about all sorts of things and how that might and how baseball might inform our perspectives about, you know, like the world around us, and similarly the world around us informs our perspectives on the game. That kind of relationship, we wanted to perpetuate that in the book, and that's where I think, again, if you end up with a much broader and more informed level of inquiry about baseball.
That's an underappreciated idea, that Bill James is an educator, and he was the outsider for so long, not in the game, just talking about things he saw, things he observed, things he studied, and came to conclusions. And so he really had this sort of, you know, message while he was teaching.
Of the informed outsider. And that was the role that we relished at Baseball Prospectus, was of being the informed outsider. Because not only were we trying to educate, but the interesting dynamic was that the education wound up being not just about the mainstream. It ended up also very quickly becoming a conversation with teams themselves about, well, have you thought about this idea? And the way in which the teams themselves identified, oh, you know, that's actually kind of interesting, or that makes me think about the game in a different way. Or because you're describing like all of the stuff that happened in baseball history as well as, you know, in the present, or you're not just, you know, like presenting me with reams of data to convince me, you're also using constructive examples from the game's history to tell me this works. This worked in the past, it will continue to work in the future, this stuff makes sense. That, you know, like in a sense, the sales pitch wasn't just subscribe to Baseball Prospectus or buy a baseball book by Baseball Prospectus. It was also about, how about adopting a whole new way of thinking about the game, or adopting these ideas that work, that will lead to winning games. And so that dovetailing that neatly in terms of education on the one hand, but then also embracing and enjoying the game in a way that, or allowing yourself to enjoy the game, but in a way that also makes a difference in terms of what you see on the field. And so it wasn't very long at all. I mean, like right at the outset, like I was already doing, you know, Cubs and White Sox post-game shows, you know, like in no time flat. So here I am, a grad student at, you know, the University of Loyola and working at the University of Chicago, and, you know, like, but I'm also like, you know, doing post-game shows on CLTV because they want my take on what's going on with those Cubs teams and whether or not Brant Brown is going to be able to make it in left field. No, he's not. So let's talk about that. You know, Henry Rodriguez, are we going to miss him? Like, is he going to hit 30 home runs? All of that stuff. Suddenly, you know, Shazam, I'm there and being taken seriously on a level that instead of just doing something that I wanted to do because it was fun and because it was interesting, suddenly it's also, I'm being taken seriously about this subject, which is pretty cool because of the strength of the team, the strength of the content, and the strength of the ideas.
Right. No, I agree with this strength of ideas. The idea couldn't be contained. I mean, it was sort of tamped down by industry potentially, and Bill James was sort of this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about because he is not a player. But it was an idea that could not be contained, and it really has exploded so much that now we're offering this MOOC, this massive open online class. Anybody can take this course and maybe start looking at some of the fundamentals of sabermetrics, start looking at the tools you need, some of the computer tools you might need. And so speak to that. What's this transition from that early kind of rebellious group of 4 or 5 on rec.sport.baseball to now Boston University is investing in the teaching of this material to many students?
Because how quickly it became something that it became a viable career choice. And not just, I mean, it wasn't very, I mean, Baseball Prospectus almost immediately started losing personnel to major league teams. Keith Law was with us for maybe 2 years before the Blue Jays snapped him up. That's pretty awesome. Suddenly it's like, okay, we can actually start quitting our day jobs and working full-time at Baseball Prospectus, but we could also wind up in industry. And that wasn't what we got into it for, but suddenly that as a possibility was this sort of like, wow, this stuff can happen. And Baseball Prospectus in particular, you know, it became this vehicle for all of us to kind of fulfill, like, you know, dream job possibilities that we had no idea could have happened in the first place. So like whether it was people leaving to join teams and work in the front office or work as statistical analysts for various teams. And the number of my former interns who were working as scouts or in front offices and then, you know, like, but a lot of us end up also working in media. So like, you know, some of us wound up writing, you know, like when now, 20 years later almost, we're talking about like me at ESPN or Jay Jaffe at Sports Illustrated or, you know, like Jonah Carey at Grantland. I mean, like, you know, Randy Gisarelli's writing for you. It's kind of interesting to look at how quickly, within 20 years, like less than 20 years, that we all went from, you know, the outsiders who were having fun with these ideas to the people who become the establishment. Because not only has the sabermetrics revolution come, but we won. We've been adopted. We went from the periphery into the center. We have become the establishment or part of the establishment. I don't think, you know, like again, you hold a revolution, you expect to be the angry outsider, maybe forever. You expect to be throwing stones, maybe forever. But, you know, at the end of the day, even Bill James gets hired, like by the Red Sox, and even all of us, you know, like the number of us who wound up like doing different consulting contracts, the kinds of people who get spun up into like an entirely different trajectory. You look at like Nate Silver's career, where, you know, like he starts off in investment banking and then he jumps to Baseball Prospectus as our in-house analyst, and then he turns that into political forecasting and superstardom. And it's like, again, none of us expect this stuff to happen, but it was open to multiple tracks. So somebody like Kevin Goldstein, who coming from a very strong scouting background, you know, but comes into it saying, like, let's talk about ways in which scouting can inform sabermetric analysis and sabermetric analysis can inform scouting. For us, that was a big step to basically say, like, we should expand our worldview to include other people's perspectives and models and teach ourselves something about something what we don't know a lot about, which was scouting. It's easy to make fun of scouts, but maybe we should shut up and listen and understand what they can teach us about the game. These are people who work in baseball professionally and spend a lot of time looking at a lot of players and know a lot about what works. Why are we ignoring that data stream? Maybe we should learn from it. So opening our own minds, even as we went along, understanding that we didn't necessarily know everything. We had a lot of good ideas, but we didn't have all the good ideas. And you have to be willing, because that's one of the other ongoing virtues of, I'd say, the revolution, is that we are informed by our colleagues and peers. There is a collegial dynamic and there's an open source dynamic where we believe in sharing research, we believe in seeing what ideas. the forcing ground of ideas that the web provides in terms of providing a constant vehicle for argument and information and exchanges of ideas leads to better content, leads to stronger ideas, leads to ongoing development. But then it's also then, because we're all doing that out loud or in public, teams are watching or media companies are watching. And so if you're good at writing about this stuff, or if you're good at doing performance analysis, people are going to snap you up. And again, that element of it, the fact that teams started hiring so many people, really then created this whole notion that, like, wow, you know, like I could go to college and instead of just being a history major who might wind up teaching history at a community college, I could be in baseball. And I didn't expect that. You know, like if you told me 20 years ago I'd wind up with this kind of job, I would have said, no idea. I don't believe that's possible. I don't think I'll wind up in the Baseball Writers Association of America, but all of these things became possible because of the revolution that we created.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I completely agree about the revolution, but in terms of scholarship, in terms of knowledge acquisition, in terms of science, which is where I come from, you know, this is what I care about. We've seen sabermetrics grow up, you know, become what it is today, but we've seen it grow up on the internet. This is not traditional scholarship. Traditional scholarship is much more sort of journal articles and, you know, long thought out research. But now we're in the internet world for true scholarship, advancing knowledge in the game and using tools that are very useful. So,
no,
you know, is this still a revolution, or are we?
Well, I think the interesting element to it is that because it's also a revolution where there's value for consumers. And to go back to the point about fantasy baseball, people want to learn about this stuff not just because they want to be informed fans, but people also want to do this stuff because they enjoy fantasy sports. And so the creation of fantasy sports as a, you know, like hobby that like millions of Americans choose, and that there's a lot of money in it, suddenly then creates this dynamic not merely of, I'd say, academically minded or educated like inquiry. It also creates this dynamic of there's an audience of consumers who have money that they want to spend on this kind of topic and this kind of subject matter. So why not serve that market? Why not, you know, create products for them? Why not do the stuff that we wish we were reading? Why not create the kind of content that lots of people enjoy? Why not sell that stuff? What's wrong with that? And so in that sense, that also, I think, helped foster what I think is the relationship with, you know, starting off as the informed outsiders to going on to the on the inside. In a sense, all of our product, our product in the same way that their product, insiders and outsiders alike, is baseball. We all love baseball, and we all share that and we want more baseball. And so, like, and feeding that for ourselves, but also feeding an audience that just can't get enough of it. Like, we all win.
Right. There is this mass of baseball fans, but now there's a mass of smarter baseball fans who want smarter and better information, potentially. And there's a market. You're right. So there's market, there's business angles here, but there's also knowledge. And being in education, this idea of knowledge acquisition, this idea of young people pursuing knowledge is can you talk about that? The idea.
Well, it's applied. I mean, again, I'm not a heavy, like, you know, quant analyst myself, but the level on which I enjoyed mathematics as a field is applied mathematics. Mathematics applied to stuff that I'm interested in, and whether that was quantitative analysis in history, but particularly quantitative analysis in baseball history, that suddenly engages my curiosity and my intellect in a way than just, you know, like playing with numbers theory by itself in a sandbox. That doesn't like twist my dials. That doesn't excite me. That doesn't, you know, like, I understand it, I get it, but it just isn't something that I'm going to do for fun. I'm not something that I'm going to invest the kind of passion and enthusiasm for it in the way that this stuff, because it's associated with something I already know and love. And so then you end up with people creating content or creating ideas that are also motivated by a passion and then also communicated to a universe of colleagues that share that passion, respect where you're coming from, and even when they, like shoot down some of your ideas because or punch some of your theories full of holes, that's part of, like the dynamic where it's like, I'm learning from you because I'm overlooked this. I'm learning from what your observations about, like my research. And again, the value to that, to make yourself better because of the quality of the people you're working with, that's academic, but it's also just, it's also kind of sports, fundamentally, is the desire to make yourself better, the desire essentially to compete in a marketplace of ideas and to be stronger than the competition or to be one of the best in that field. Of course, I mean, then that motivates people, but it also creates, like, even in the rivalries or tensions among different purveyors of baseball content, it still creates, I think, a fundamental respect because it's like, wow, they really did a great study. Wow, I did not know that before. Or, I really had never thought about catcher framing in that way, and now this suddenly taught me something that, I may have been at this for a couple of decades, but I'm learning something new, and I've got to keep my mind open to learning something new because the next generation of sabermetric analysts, they've got a ton of great observations. And so in the same way that the things that we were thinking of, say, 20 years ago, might have been revolutionary or evolutionary and educational for the previous generation, the Palmers or the Jameses or the Gillettes or the Thorns, the way in which we learned from them and perhaps also helped educate them in some ideas or created new understandings of the game. When you talk about something as revolutionary as Forrest McCracken's, realization on, essentially defensive efficiency and batting average on balls in play. I mean, that's one of the most revolutionary leaps in the last 20 years. He came after us and he taught us something. And we all have to, that's where, that respect as an educational component of shut up and listen. He's smart. He knows something you don't. Even if you've been good at this for a long time, shut up and listen. So in the same way that we, as angry outsiders, might have been saying that to people on the inside, shut up and listen, we have something important to say, or you're going to learn something from us if we talk about this, not lecturing, but I have something to share. Maybe if you listen to what I have to say, this will actually help you. Similarly, we have to take a turn on that, particular, hamster wheel as well, and say, it's our turn to shut up and listen. Somebody else has a really great idea. Is that going to make us stronger and smarter if we listen and we learn from it? Absolutely. And so if you close your mind to that, if you pretend you know it all at any point, you've only hamstrung yourself and you're hamstrung your own career in something that you're supposed to be passionate about.